The sky hung above like a slab of lead, suspended just low enough to press on my senses without ever fully descending. Inside the vibrating body of the helicopter, I stared through the foggy window, watching the Gulf of Mexico stretch endlessly in every direction. The sea shifted between blue and gray, its surface unbroken by land, only the occasional ripple hinting at motion beneath. The thrum of the rotor blades pushed against my chest like a second heartbeat. I had flown over deserts, forests, cities, but nothing prepared me for this, an ocean that refused to end. Back in Texas, I had worked on rigs before. I wasn't fresh off training like some greenhorn chasing danger for its own sake. I had experience, a degree in petroleum engineering, and the hardened attitude that came with years of field work. But this assignment was different. The money alone was staggering, nearly double my previous contracts. Yet what unsettled me more was the speed, the way events had unfolded with unsettling urgency, the way the company's recruiters had moved mountains to bring me on board in less than a week. It had felt less like a job offer and more like an enlistment. The rig emerged slowly from the haze as the helicopter began its descent. At first I mistook it for a cargo ship, then some sort of sea fortress. But within seconds, its true shape revealed itself, a sprawling metallic behemoth anchored in the middle of the deep. Towering cranes rotated in synchronized silence, rust-colored pipes wrapped around its central column like arteries. Steel walkways crossed like spider webs above the churning dark. It was neither ship nor shore. It was something else entirely, a city carved out of iron and isolation. The moment the skids touched down, a gust of hot, salt-heavy air swept through the cabin. I stepped out, and the scent of diesel and rust punched me in the face. Beneath my boots, the metal deck hummed with a resonance beyond the rhythm of machines, something deeper, a vibration that felt almost alive. The entire structure breathed. It breathed through long, mechanical exhales, steady and unnerving. It was less like stepping into a workplace and more like entering the ribs of a beast. A man approached from the far side of the landing pad. He wore a navy blue coverall streaked with oil and time. His gait was firm, but one leg dragged slightly, as if the rig itself had taken its toll. Without introduction, he handed me a pair of thick, yellow-tinted goggles. The lenses were scratched but sturdy, the frame slightly warped. "Put these on. Keep them on, even at night," he said. His voice was sharp, direct. "You'll understand why soon enough." I blinked. I opened my mouth to ask a question, but the man turned and walked away without responding. After a few steps, he stopped and reached into his breast pocket. From it, he produced a sealed envelope, plain and unmarked, the kind used for confidential memos or final warnings. He handed it over. "This is your briefing. Memorize it. Don't ask questions about it. You've already signed everything necessary." I stared at the envelope in my hand, the weight of it oddly disproportionate to its size. I had signed the contract before ever laying eyes on this place, back in a sterile office in Houston, where the recruiter's words had moved faster than my doubt. At the time, the numbers had silenced my caution. Now, standing in the belly of this iron leviathan, I couldn't help but wonder if that decision had been mine at all, or if I had simply stepped into a story already written. The man walked ahead. I fell into step behind him, clutching the envelope. The walkway beneath us clanged with each footfall, a harsh metal echo swallowed by the wind. Around us, workers moved in practiced silence. The mechanical symphony of generators and cranes filled the air, the shriek of gears locked in endless duty. We crossed several junctions, past stairwells leading both up and deep below, until we reached the personnel quarters. As I paused to open the envelope, something in the distance groaned. Not machinery. Something deeper, older. But when I looked up, only the cranes were moving, slow and indifferent. I sat on a metal bench tucked into the corner of the corridor, away from the foot traffic. The envelope crinkled slightly as I tore open its flap and slid out a single sheet of paper. 7 lines greeted me. There was a lack of letterhead and signature, containing only 7 numbered rules, printed in bold type, their austerity more unsettling than any detailed instruction manual. They read like commandments, though no one had called them that. I began reading the first one slowly. 1. Always wear the yellow goggles, even at night. The instruction made me blink. Goggles for nighttime? I expected safety gear, but this felt excessive. Still, I looked at the scratched lenses in my hand and couldn't bring myself to argue. Maybe they knew something I didn't. 2. Never descend to the lowest level alone, especially at night. It struck me as oddly specific. I hadn't even seen the lower levels yet, but the phrasing told me all I needed. Something about that place demanded company, or at least a witness. 3. If you see blood or a bloodstain, do not touch it. Contact the designated unit immediately. Straightforward. Strange, but straightforward. Still, the idea that blood warranted a dedicated response team felt ominous. Had there been accidents down here? Or worse? 4. If the clock reverses, hide and remain silent. I raised my eyebrows. The clock? What kind of malfunction would make time run backward? I couldn't make sense of it, and that alone made it unsettling. 5. No group of 3 or more is allowed outside designated work zones. That one was bureaucratic on the surface. A measure to prevent horseplay, maybe. Or perhaps the management didn't like too much chatter outside of controlled spaces. 6. Radios must remain on the assigned frequency at all times. That made operational sense, but written here with the rest, it suggested something more. Like deviation came with consequences. 7. One employee will be served a special meal each week. That employee is to finish it completely. This reads like tradition. A morale booster, maybe. Yet the phrasing put me off. Is to finish it completely. Not optional, not celebratory. It sounded like an obligation. I read over them again. The rules stood apart, disconnected at first glance, but collectively outlined a rigid framework for life on the rig. They seemed designed to enforce control, although the rationale behind each remained hidden. I wasn't sure if they were intended to protect us or to ensure our compliance. I stared ahead for a long time, letting the weight of the words sink in. Each line hinted at a context I had not yet encountered. They carried the chill of something prearranged and enforced with precision. These weren't mere guidelines. They read like terms of an agreement I had already entered into. I folded the paper and tucked it into my breast pocket. As I glanced out the narrow porthole, something quick and large flickered in the mist near the base of the rig. I dismissed it as a bird or a drifting shadow, unwilling to consider anything more. Behind me, the metal door shut with a mechanical sigh. The rig, it seemed, had swallowed me whole. That evening, after a lukewarm meal and a brief orientation video that said more in what it omitted than what it declared, I wandered the rig alone. The fading light painted the walkways in layers of copper and violet. I passed bulkheads, storage containers, coiled hosing, and workers whose faces seemed to blur in the shadows. Eventually, I found myself standing before a steel door, marked only by a keypad and a yellowed sign that had been scratched beyond recognition. Behind it, a stairwell led downward, disappearing into dimness that no bulb seemed able to penetrate. I did not open it. The thought crossed my mind, lingered there, but I pulled it back. I would be working down there eventually, and I wasn't about to set the wrong tone on my first day. Instead, I stood still, hand grazing the railing, aware of the cold draft whispering out from below, and let curiosity remain unanswered for now. By the time I returned to my quarters, night had deepened. The wind scraped along the walls like distant fingernails. Metal groaned in places it shouldn't. I stood at the center of the small room, feeling the strangeness of it all settle around me. My first hours on the rig had already gone in a direction I hadn't expected. There was something eerie in the air, true, but beneath it ran the thrill of finally working where I had always aimed to be. A place where my training, my experience, my time meant something, where the work mattered, where the stakes were real. I undressed, set my boots by the locker, folded my coveralls, and reached for the goggles. It felt strange to wear them indoors, even stranger at night, but I didn't hesitate for long. If that was the rule, I'd follow it. They wouldn't make it mandatory without reason. With a breath, I slid them over my eyes. The yellow tint dulled the edges of the room, softening the electric light into a murky sepia. I lay back on the cot, arms across my chest, the light vibration of the rig running through the mattress like a living pulse. It was already clear this job would be nothing like the work I'd done on land. The morning light on the rig was unlike anything I'd known on land. It had a way of spreading itself thin, filtering through salt-heavy air and the geometry of iron beams until it felt more like a suggestion than a presence. I opened my eyes to that watery glow, already aware of the low tremble under my cot. It was a reminder that I was not on Earth, not exactly, but on a suspended colossus, floating in industrial limbo. My goggles were still on. They'd pressed a shallow ridge into my forehead overnight, but I left them there. Part habit, part caution. The rules had a way of sticking, even the ones that didn't make sense. Outside, the corridor buzzed with the dull routine of machinery. I made my way to the mess hall, where the silence said more than any conversation could. The room was full, yet the air was thick with unsaid things. Conversations were quiet, and eyes were tired. I noticed how many wore their goggles like I did, even while eating. No one looked at each other for long. A man in an orange jumpsuit, older and weather-creased, nodded at me and handed me a clipboard. "You're with Reed today. Tool check in 15. Then he turned away without another word. His abruptness hit me harder than I expected. I'd worked in rough environments before, places where pleasantries weren't common, but this felt different. There was no sense of camaraderie, no trace of acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum. It was as if I'd walked into a prison instead of a job site, and the guards didn't bother pretending otherwise. Reed turned out to be tall and clean-shaven, with a lined face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. We met near the central shaft where the rig's vertical core loomed like the spine of some long-buried animal. He skipped introductions and skipped the handshake. His eyes brushed over me, and he tilted his head toward the elevator that descended into the lower levels. I followed. The elevator whined as it dropped us down. Each floor we passed got darker, damper, and more distant from the rhythm of the upper decks. The metal walls here were lined with condensation. Pipes hissed, like breathing things. As we stepped out, the lights above flickered, casting brief shadows that stretched too long for comfort. I took it all in, how the air grew heavy, how sound muffled itself in corners, and asked, "What exactly goes on down here?" Reed didn't stop walking. "Stick to the inspection points, don't wander." "But what is this level for? It feels different. There's even a rule written just for this place." He turned, finally meeting my eyes behind our shared yellow tint. "Best not to ask questions about this part. Do your work, follow the checklist, and we'll get out clean." That was the first time I heard the phrase, "get out clean," used like that. It wasn't about oil or grease, it was something else. We moved through a narrow tunnel of steel, our boots echoing softly in tandem. The smell here had shifted, less diesel, more brine and metal. There were valves to check, pressure gauges to log, and seals to mark for maintenance. I noticed how Reed never let me walk behind him. He always positioned himself so I was either beside or slightly ahead, as if he didn't trust his back to anyone in this space. I started to understand why. Our checklist was nearly done by the time we looped back toward the junction where we'd started. I felt a slight easing in Reed's posture, and I assumed we were wrapping up for the day. We turned a corner into a wider hall where the overhead clock came into view. It was mounted high on a bulkhead, slightly dusted but unmistakably working. Or so I thought. As I lifted my pen to mark the final reading, The corridor lights faltered. First a dimming, then a violent stutter, like a heartbeat gone arrhythmic. I looked up instinctively. The second hand had slowed to a crawl, paused for a breathless moment, then resumed its motion in a slow, steady reversal. My breath caught. I remembered the list, the part about the clock. The rule had seemed absurd when I read it, a kind of scare tactic meant to keep new hires alert. But now, as I watched that second hand tick backwards, the warning felt carved into stone. My voice came out lower than I expected. Is that supposed to happen? Reed turned his head slowly, saw what I was seeing, and without a word, dropped into a crouch beside the nearest wall. He gestured sharply for me to do the same. I lowered myself. Heart pounding. The metal felt colder now. Reed pressed his fingers to his lips, the gesture universal. Silence. I heard something. A pulse. It felt as if an immense creature breathed beneath the surface, its exhale slow and deliberate, displacing water in a way that echoed through the steel floor. The rhythm wasn't steady. It surged in deep, irregular waves, like a body moving through the sea, brushing against the walls of its enclosure. Each vibration whispered of weight and purpose. I dared not speak. Something in my bones told me to remain absolutely still. The clock continued its slow, reversed ticking. In the silence, it became thunderous, a countdown to something I couldn't name. Reed kept his eyes down, goggles firm on his face. I mirrored him. The corridor stretched before us, shadowed and indifferent. Then, as abruptly as it started, the reversed ticking ceased. The second hand stopped again. The normal hum of electricity returned, and the lights steadied. Reed didn't move for another 30 seconds, then finally exhaled and stood up. "Why?" I started, but he cut me off with a glance. His calm, rehearsed control unsettled me. How could he act like this was normal? Like it was a scheduled drill rather than something unnatural twisting the core of this place? I stared at him, trying to understand how a man could witness that and respond with such clarity. "Don't speak about it. Just note the time on your log and move on." I scribbled down the numbers with a shaky hand. My thoughts raced with speculation, but I forced myself to file them away for later. The rig had its own logic, and it demanded obedience over curiosity. We moved forward, turning into a side hall lined with closed doors. My pulse still hadn't returned to normal after what we had just seen. The image of that clock rewinding, the strange pulse reverberating through the walls, it stayed with me like a shadow clinging to my back. I kept thinking about the rule. If the clock ticks in reverse, hide and stay silent. At the time, it felt like a superstition meant to unnerve us. But now I wasn't so sure. What kind of place writes rules for time moving backwards? Reed stopped abruptly. His entire frame tensed as if struck by a silent alarm. There was a taut readiness in his body that said this was not unfamiliar to him. He'd lived it before. He knew what came next. That unsettled me more than anything else could have. I followed his line of sight. On the metal floor just ahead, a dark pool of blood had settled in an unnatural stillness. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't aged into obscurity either. The edges had begun to crust, a rusty brown outline enclosing a thick, almost congealed center. It looked like it had been waiting there for someone to notice. I stepped forward before I could stop myself, driven by the instinct to investigate, to help, maybe even just to understand. "Don't," Reed snapped, voice sharp as broken glass. "Not even close." I froze, mid-step. His tone was commanding in a way that revealed deep fear. That realization gripped my chest harder than the sight of blood ever could. He pulled the radio from his belt and clicked through frequencies until he hit the designated channel. "This is Deck C4. We have a red mark sighting. Send containment." Static crackled, followed by a brief affirmation. Reed tucked the radio away and gave me a look I couldn't interpret. A moment later, distant metallic footsteps echoed faintly through the corridor. The containment team was on its way. The sound grew louder with a rhythm that felt trained and familiar, not panicked. Whatever they were coming for, they had done it before. "Let's go," he said. "We finished the route. They'll handle that." I couldn't stop glancing back. I had seen blood on rigs before. Accidents were part of the job. Yet something about Reed's response unsettled me. The precision with which he changed the radio frequency, the speed of his call, and the unyielding order to stay away all pointed to a deeper concern. I found myself wondering whether it had really been blood. Could it have been a chemical leak mistaken for something else? Or was it somehow connected to the strange behavior of the clock earlier? The thoughts circled, refusing to settle. As we continued, I understood something in my gut. The rig had rules because failing to follow them could trigger consequences no one wanted to name aloud. Each directive seemed designed to preserve safety, a desperate attempt to contain something too dangerous to explain. The shift ended with Reed giving me a simple nod before disappearing toward the higher decks. Without a debrief or a single word of explanation, I stood at the stairwell, one foot on the bottom step, the other hesitant. I went back up slowly, goggles fogged at the edges, brain cluttered with questions I had no business asking. Someone needed to explain this. The rule sheet had hinted at danger, but no one had bothered to say what kind. I looked for a face, a gesture, anything that might crack the silence, but every technician I passed seemed locked in their own quiet routine. It was as if the entire facility had taken a vow of silence, their avoidance of conversation shaped by something more than habit, molded into policy. By the time I reached my quarters, the hallway lights had dimmed to a steady amber hue. I closed the door and leaned back against it, letting the cold press through my shirt into my spine. Inside, the silence pressed in from all sides. I sat on the cot, goggles still in place, and tried to steady my breathing. The day had left me shaken. The rules weren't suggestions. They were barriers, and something was pressing against them from the other side. I didn't know what. I only knew I had followed the instructions and still felt like I had come too close to something no one wanted to acknowledge. The rig demanded compliance, and today I understood why. I woke with the weight of the goggles pressing deep lines into my face, the plastic digging into the bridge of my nose, and the soft skin around my eyes. The habit of wearing them through the night had become more than routine. It had become a kind of tether, an unspoken pact with the silence that hovered over everything. But now they itched. They pressed too hard. The skin beneath them was tender, and I felt the discomfort crawling toward pain. I sat up slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dim glow filtering through the slit-like window. The rig outside breathed its metal rhythm, steady and uncaring. I rubbed the marks on my face, then reached for the radio unit clipped to my belt. It was routine now to check it. I always checked the same frequency and channel. Still, something in me hesitated. I turned the dial just a touch. Static. Another notch. A hum. Then a voice. I turned the dial again. Two voices slipped through the static, low, deliberate, and unaware they were being heard. One of them spoke first, his tone composed but distant, like someone reading from a checklist. He has no one, no wife, no kids, no legal attachments. It's a clean choice. The second voice, slightly raspier and more casual, answered quickly. And he's quiet, keeps to himself, doesn't poke around. There was a long pause, the kind that thickens the air. Then came a brief chuckle, more like an exhale than laughter. He won't be missed. I leaned in, barely breathing. Something about the way they spoke felt rehearsed. They weren't debating, they were confirming. A final decision disguised as routine. The first voice returned, its edge sharpened. Then it settled, set the table. My pulse kicked. I didn't know who they were talking about, but the clinical tone of their discussion chilled me. A clean choice. Set the table. The phrasing felt rehearsed, euphemistic, and then I heard the word dinner. That's when the door slid open. A tall man in a blue utility jacket stepped in, his boots scuffing the threshold. He walked straight to me, plucked the radio from my hand, adjusted the dial back to the assigned frequency, and thrust it into my palm. Frequencies are locked for a reason. You change them again, and you're endangering everyone. Understood? I nodded, stunned. He left without another word. I sat there a moment longer, the radio still warm in my hand. The voices I had heard replayed in my mind, their cold precision, the way they chose someone, as if it were an inventory task. And now this. His urgency, the way he snatched the device, as if I'd stumbled onto something I had no right to witness. It wasn't just a security protocol. There was something they were trying very hard to keep buried. Whatever this plan was, whatever they were preparing for, it was important enough to shield with silence and sealed channels, and I had caught a sliver of it by accident. Moments later, another knock came. A crew coordinator stepped into the room, his tone all duty and no warmth. He didn't ask how I was, didn't look twice at my face or the mark the goggles had left, just handed me a folded assignment sheet like sliding a file under a prison cell door. "You're with Baker today. Reed's rerouted." I nodded again, slower this time. There was no room for questions, no chance to object. It felt less like taking a new post and more like being transferred under surveillance. The way orders were handed down, the way eyes lingered in the halls. This place operated more like a sentence than a workplace. And when I had joked before about it being a prison, I hadn't realized how close I was to the truth. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about Reed. He was the only one here who had spoken to me with any trace of normalcy, the only presence that made this place feel somewhat navigable. There was a quiet steadiness about him, not warm, but not cold either. He responded when I spoke, didn't turn away. And now, without a word, he was gone. It made me wonder if I had pushed too far with my questions the day before, if I had drawn the wrong kind of attention. Maybe his removal was meant as a warning. Maybe it was my fault. Outside, the platform groaned beneath a shifting tide, and the day began. The mess hall carried a heavier quiet than usual. Trays clattered against metal tables, boots echoed on the grated floor, and everyone kept their eyes on their plates. Conversations were nearly non-existent, drowned out by the metallic scrape of utensils and the low hum of overhead lights. Most were too focused on chewing, swallowing, and keeping their heads down to notice anything else. Then the overhead speaker clicked on, breaking the dull rhythm. A flat voice echoed through the room. "Special meal assignment. Baker. Section D double quote." No one clapped or nodded. Not a single reaction acknowledged the announcement. Heads lifted only for a moment, then dropped back to their meals. Baker himself barely reacted. He stood, walked to the counter and was handed a tray, unlike the others. Stainless steel with a covered dish, a small cup of something viscous and dark beside it. I watched him from 2 tables over, stunned into stillness. My mind reeled back to the voices I'd picked up that morning, the calm discussion about selecting someone with no family, no attachments, someone who wouldn't be missed. Baker's name hadn't been mentioned, but the coincidence gnawed at me. Out of everyone, he was the one chosen for this special meal. Was it really random? Or had I overheard the plan before it unfolded? My stomach tightened further as I realized I was now paired with him for the day. I didn't know what exactly had been decided over that hidden frequency, but the possibility that Baker was at the center of it made my skin crawl. I wondered, with a cold kind of fear, whether I'd be expected to watch something happen to him or help cover it up. Baker returned to his seat and ate in silence. His movements were mechanical. He chewed slowly, swallowed with effort. His hands trembled once, then steadied. I kept expecting him to stop, but he finished everything on the tray. When he was done, he simply stood and waited. After Baker finished his meal, he stood without speaking and made his way toward the door. I hesitated before rising to follow. My limbs felt heavy, as if that quiet meal had shifted the atmosphere around us. We left the mess in silence, walking side by side toward the southern sector where our assignment waited. The corridors felt longer than usual, stretched by the weight of what I had seen and heard. The maintenance zone loomed ahead, lit by flickering overheads that hummed just above hearing. Pipes lined the walls, sweating condensation that dropped like slow rain onto the metal grates below. The air was dense with salt and machinery. Our boots left dark, wet trails behind us. Baker hadn't spoken once since we'd left the mess. I glanced at him more than once, noting the stiffness in his shoulders, the vacant look in his eyes. Something in him had gone slack, like a wire pulled too tight had finally snapped. Trying to cut through the silence, I asked if he was feeling all right. "Just tired," he muttered. It was the kind of answer you give when you don't want follow-up questions. His voice was flat, missing the human flicker of mood or thought. I tried again, softer this time. "Have you ever talked to your family from out here?" He stopped walking for a beat, then turned to look at me. His eyes held me for longer than felt natural. Then, barely audible, he said, "Not in a while." We resumed walking. I kept pace beside him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching someone dissolving from the inside out. His steps lagged behind slightly. He forgot basic steps in our procedure, missed hand signals, and overlooked tools right in front of him. When he bent to pick up a pipe joint, his fingers swiped past it like he wasn't fully seeing it. Then, as he reached for a wrench, it slipped through his grip and crashed onto the floor. He didn't even flinch. I leaned closer, voice low. "They might have done something to your food. Are you sure you're all right?" He turned to me, his lips parted slightly as if trying to respond, but no words came. His gaze passed through me. It was like trying to talk to someone underwater, distorted and unreachable. His breath had become shallow. His eyes were glazed over. I said his name once, then again. And then he dropped. I caught him by reflex, arms wrapping around his torso to stop his head from hitting the grated floor. He was still breathing, but unresponsive, eyes open yet blank. The coldness of his skin startled me. My hands trembled as I reached for the radio clipped to my side. My thumb struggled to find the button, every second dragging beneath the weight of panic. "This is Section D, immediate medical. Crew member down." A crackle of static broke the silence. Then a curt voice answered, devoid of emotion. "Acknowledged. Hold position." The line went dead. I crouched beside Baker, watching his chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven movements. His skin had taken on a pale sheen, and his eyes, though open, showed nothing. There was no recognition, no flicker of awareness. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. Two figures appeared from around the corner, clad head to toe in pristine white hazard suits. Their movements were synchronized, practiced, almost too smooth. They moved in silence, neither speaking nor asking questions. They lifted Baker between them, careful yet impersonal, and turned back the way they came. I pushed myself to my feet and stumbled after them. "Wait! Where are you taking him? What happened to him?" One of the figures paused just long enough to glance over their shoulder. The helmet obscured their face entirely. "Take a break. Return to quarters. That's your instruction." Then they continued without hesitation, their boots echoing against the metal floor until the sound disappeared into the rig's deeper corridors. I remained there, rooted to the spot, watching the empty hallway. 1,000 questions pressed against my skull, but none found a voice. I didn't know whether to follow or flee. All I knew was that something had just shifted, and whatever came next, I would face it alone. I returned to my quarters, but rest was impossible. My legs wouldn't stay still, and my thoughts refused to settle. The silence in the room felt tighter than usual, like the walls themselves were listening. Eventually, I stepped out, and began to wander the rig, drifting through corridors as if searching for something unnamed. The lights flickered overhead in irregular patterns, and every closed door hummed with quiet tension. My feet carried me closer to the lower levels. I wasn't even sure how far I had gone until I noticed the air thickening, the metal walls sweating with condensation. Then I saw him. At the far end of the corridor, barely lit by the emergency bulbs, stood Baker. I ducked behind a column instinctively, my heart pounding. He moved slowly, almost floating, his steps aimless and detached. His posture was unnatural, his head angled slightly as if listening to something deep beneath the platform. I checked my watch. It was late, far past curfew for non-critical zones. What was he doing here? Without hesitation, he approached the door that led to the bottom deck, the one marked off in the protocol. He pressed his hand against the panel and it slid open with a reluctant hiss. Then he stepped through. He didn't close it. Compelled by something between curiosity and dread, I followed. I crept along the edge of the metal walkway, keeping to the shadows. The lower deck opened into a vast chamber with exposed piping and vents that bled steam. I climbed a ladder that led to a service catwalk above, giving me a vantage point. From there, I watched him. Baker stood near the grated center of the platform where an open shaft descended directly into the sea. He swayed slightly, eyes unfocused. That's when I noticed he wasn't wearing his goggles, the one thing we were told to never remove, the one rule drilled into us from day one. My breath caught in my throat, and a sick realization crawled up my spine. The stillness shattered. A sudden low roar erupted from below, like something massive shifting through deep water. It vibrated through the steel under my feet and rattled the railings. The sound was thick, wet, and unmistakably organic. Not a machine, not an echo. It reminded me of a creature surfacing for air, exhaling as it moved beneath the platform. My whole body tensed as the noise faded, but the weight of it lingered in the air. I turned, and my gaze locked on the maintenance clock mounted above the exit hatch. It had stopped. Its hands began ticking backward. The rule, the one I had read, the warning. I dropped back down, heart hammering, and slipped through the lower corridor. I crouched behind a series of barrels, my view partially obscured, but enough to still see Baker. His body jerked forward once, then again, and then he vanished. Not with a scream, not with struggle. It was as if the sea reached up through the shaft and plucked him away. A quiet, horrifying pull. I stayed hidden, barely breathing, until the sound stopped and the air cleared. When I stepped back out, the door still hung open. My eyes darted back to the shaft one last time, unsure whether what I had just witnessed had truly happened. My heart hammered in my chest as I inched toward the exit, each step unsteady. The hands on the wall clock had begun to move normally again, ticking forward as if nothing had happened. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to process it all. It felt like I was walking out of a dream I couldn't fully wake from. Without looking back again, I made my way into the corridor, dazed and reeling, determined to return to my room. I needed to sit, to think, to breathe. A figure turned the corner just as I crossed the threshold. One of the supervisors. His face twisted into something like panic before hardening. "What are you doing here? You're not authorized to be down here. Baker, he went in there. Something took him. I saw it happen. He didn't struggle." The supervisor's eyes didn't flicker. His voice stayed level, colder than before. "That's enough. You saw nothing that concerns you." He didn't care, not a trace of urgency, not a single word of concern, as if it hadn't mattered at all, as if Baker never existed. He grabbed my arm, tight. "Return to your quarters, now." He didn't let go until we had cleared the hall. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, shaking. It was no longer speculation, no longer distant. I had seen it. Something lived beneath this place, and it had taken Baker. The thought wouldn't leave me. The goggles were more than a uniform requirement. They served a purpose, a shield against something real. Every rule we were given carried weight, not as suggestions, but as barriers between us and something far worse. I wasn't safe, not even close. The events of the previous day had unsettled me to the core. I couldn't sleep without replaying every moment. Baker's distant eyes, the tremor in his hands, the way he collapsed without resistance. The look on his face showed no pain. Something inside had simply gone dark. The silence afterward was louder than any scream. This wasn't exhaustion or illness. This was something else, and no one seemed interested in explaining it. By morning, I felt a new kind of resolve. I needed to know what this place really was. Baker's disappearance couldn't be treated like an accident. There had to be documentation, incident reports, logs, anything. I didn't know what I expected to find, but the impulse to uncover something real, something I could hold on to, was stronger than my fear. There was a place I hadn't been allowed to enter, the archive level. I'd passed the door during earlier maintenance routes. It was sealed with a coated panel and bore a metal placard reading, "Restricted personnel only." That had to be it. When the corridor was clear, I made my way down the eastern arm of the rig. The door stood at the far end, unguarded but completely sealed. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I would do if I actually made it inside, but the keypad was locked. I tapped it once, twice, hoping for a prompt or a hint. Nothing. There was no key card or biometric scan, only a blank denial. Disappointed but still desperate, I returned to my quarters. There had to be another way to listen in, to intercept what they were hiding. That's when I thought of the radio. I had heard them talk about the food and about Baker. If those voices had used a hidden frequency once, maybe others did too. Maybe the right frequency would unlock what doors could not. I sat down, clipped the unit from my belt, and turned the dial slowly. Static came in waves. Sometimes it sounded like breathing. I adjusted the tuner with small, careful movements, my ears strained for any sign of a voice. As I kept turning the dial, the radio suddenly froze on a single frequency. A strange, high-pitched tone began to emit from the speaker, thin and sharp, like a whistle inside a metal chamber. My hand instinctively pulled back, but the sound held, vibrating through the room. Then the space around me shifted. A low vibration rippled through the air as if pressure had dropped. The metal floor warmed beneath my boots. I couldn't make sense of it. Then a sound came through the walls, a deep, warbling moan, something massive stirring beneath the platform. I stood up instinctively. The sound grew louder and the radio in my hand vibrated slightly. Then I felt it, a presence. The lights flickered once. My breathing stopped. It came from the direction of the shaft. Heavy air, like water displaced by something moving through it. I pressed myself to the wall. A shape appeared through the far window. At first, it seemed like a figure, but as it drew closer, it became something else entirely. Its form pulsed and shifted, soaked and glistening as if it had just risen from the depths. Long, thin arms hung low, fingers webbed and twitching. Along its limbs, patches of glistening skin opened and closed like gills, releasing thin streams of water that trailed behind it. Rows of small circular suction marks lined the underside of its arms, and the sides of its neck expanded with each slow breath. It was as if a deep-sea creature had taken on a partial human frame, a grotesque fusion of form built for movement through dark waters. Its chest rose and fell with a slow, fluid rhythm. The closer it came, the more I saw the water still trickling from its shoulders and spine, pooling at its feet in a small puddle. It had heard something. It was searching. For a moment, I thought it saw me. Its head tilted slightly, revealing a single reflective eye, too large for its face. I froze in place. My goggles were still on. It hovered in place, twitching slightly. It didn't move toward me or strike. It simply stayed there, studying, and in that moment, I understood something vital. Those goggles were not ordinary safety gear. They were a layer of defense, a shield. They kept me invisible to it. Whatever that thing was, it couldn't see me through the lenses. That rule on the list, the one about never taking them off, made sense now in a terrifyingly real way. Then, the radio crackled again. Instantly, the creature turned, its head snapping toward the sound. It began to drift forward, moving with a slow, controlled precision that betrayed its size. It moved toward the device in my hand. I understood then that it had locked onto the radio. I took a slow, cautious step backward, then another, my eyes fixed on the creature's reflective gaze. It didn't lose focus. It began to follow, its dripping form gliding forward as if pulled by an invisible thread. I continued to back away, one measured step at a time, until the edge of the platform came into view. The sea below lapped softly against the rig's supports. I watched the creature's head tilt slightly, its attention unwavering. The high-pitched tone still buzzed from the device in my hand. I raised the radio slightly, then, with precise timing, hurled it into the dark water below. The moment the splash echoed, the presence moved. It turned with fluid, silent grace and disappeared beneath the waves. I stood there, breathless. The rule had made sense now. Keep the radios on the same frequency, not to stop leaks, to stop calls. I leaned against the wall, shaking. They weren't hiding accidents. They were hiding something alive, and they were keeping us just alive enough to keep the rig running, risking our lives daily for profit. That was the truth. We were expendable as long as the work continued. And now I had seen what lay beneath our feet. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not yet. I wasn't sure I had the words, but I knew I couldn't carry this alone. I needed to find someone who had seen something, someone who had doubts like I did, someone who might have glimpsed what took Baker. As I replayed the scene in my head, a question settled deep inside me. Was that the same creature? The one that moved with wet, fluid grace, eyes reflecting unnatural light? Had I just witnessed the thing that dragged him down into the sea? So I started small. In the morning, I passed a worker in the supply corridor and asked him if he had ever seen anything strange near the lower decks. He didn't answer, just adjusted his grip on the crate and walked faster. Later, in the engine hall, I spotted two crewmen checking gauges. I approached casually, offered a nod, and asked about Baker. Their eyes narrowed slightly. One of them mumbled something about not being authorized to discuss assignments. Then they both turned their backs. I kept my distance, but followed the flow of movement. Tried again at lunch. No one made eye contact. I knew I had drawn attention to myself, but I needed answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, avoided deliberately. Still, a part of me clung to the thought that someone must know the truth. I had to keep looking. Then, late in the afternoon, I found myself in the central walkway alongside two other workers who had lingered after shift rotation. I asked them directly this time if they knew what the goggles were really for. Before they could even react, one of them stepped back and raised his hand. "Over here," he called. "We've got a breach." A voice barked from behind. 3 or more outside designated work zones is a breach. I turned to them in disbelief. "You really called them on me?" "I was just trying to talk," I said sharply, my voice low but laced with anger. Their expressions stayed blank. One avoided my eyes entirely. The other gave a subtle shrug, like it was nothing personal. 2 guards approached at a brisk pace. Their expressions didn't betray any emotion. They scanned our badges, confirmed our identities, and separated us without further explanation. "You've been warned," one said. I tried to protest, but they grabbed me by the arm and turned me down the side corridor. I didn't resist. There was no point. Within minutes, I was escorted to a small cell near the center shaft. 1 bed, 1 vent, a metal door. That was the moment I became certain that this place wasn't just operating like a prison. It truly was one. The lock clanked shut. There was no explanation or processing. Isolation. I sat on the edge of the bed, palms sweaty. This was no standard disciplinary action. It was complete containment. I'd asked the wrong questions. I'd stood too close. How could the thirst for profit justify risking every soul on this rig? How do you continue your day with something like that lurking beneath your feet? I'd reached toward something they wanted buried, and now they were showing me just how far they'd go to keep it that way. Time passed in a strange, windowless loop. I heard footsteps echo, doors creak, and water drip. But no one came, until a shadow passed between waking and dream, close and real. I saw it glide across the floor, stretching toward me. At first, it was just motion, but then it came closer, deliberate steps, silent, unmistakable. Someone was outside. A figure moved into view, cloaked and slow, as if drawn forward by the dark. I sat up, tense. My eyes adjusted to the low light, and I saw the fabric of a hood, the glint of boots, and it was heading straight for my cell door. It was after lights out. The corridor outside was silent, save for the occasional knock of metal against metal. A figure appeared beyond the tiny glass slit, covered in a hood, face obscured. They knelt beside the door and leaned close. It wasn't a guard. It wasn't a creature. This was someone making a choice to be here, not someone sent. Whoever it was, they had come alone. "I saw you," he whispered. "At the archive room. I know what you're looking for." I stood up slowly, cautious. The figure remained crouched at the door, face hidden beneath the hood. My mind raced. Who was he? A worker like me? Someone with access? Or something else entirely? I searched for some detail, anything to anchor his presence to something real. Nothing came. "I can help you," he said. "I have access, but I need something in return." I stayed silent, unsure whether this was bait or a lifeline. Could I trust someone who approached in shadows and offered forbidden knowledge? Was this a trap set by the very people I was trying to expose? "You get the documents," he said, voice steady. "You take them off this rig. You tell people. Make them listen." My thoughts tumbled. If he was telling the truth, this could change everything. But if he wasn't, why? I finally asked. A long pause followed. Then came his answer. "Because I can't. But listen carefully. Tomorrow, after your shift, return to your quarters. Wait there. No matter what happens, they'll still assign you to work. That's your window." The moment hung in the air. Then he vanished from the slit of glass, his presence swallowed by silence. I heard his boots fade into the distance. The door stayed locked. I was left with a plan I hadn't expected, and a stranger I wasn't sure I could trust. But one thing was certain now. This had to be done. This prison, this hidden world under the guise of industry, needed to be known. Sleep never truly came to me that night. The metallic hum of the rig, the faint dripping sounds echoing from the pipes, and the replay of the creature's stare had all combined to create a sleepless fog in my mind. My limbs were heavy, and my thoughts scattered. As the morning light filtered in through the tiny grated vent, I was already awake, sitting upright, waiting. The door creaked open with a metallic groan, and a guard entered with a tray. He didn't say a word beyond what was necessary. "Eat! You're back on duty today." He handed me the tray, then placed a printed slip of paper on the metal desk beside the bed. My name was on it, followed by an alphanumeric location code. That was where I'd be stationed for the day. The moment he left, I forced myself to eat, barely tasting anything. I washed quickly, dressed, and fitted my goggles back over my eyes. As the lens locked into place, I couldn't help but remember the watery stare of that creature. These goggles had saved me once. They were the only shield I had. Work passed slowly. Every step I took, I felt the weight of eyes on me. Faces turned just slightly too late when I looked up. Conversations hushed. No one said anything directly, but it was obvious I had drawn unwanted attention. They all knew, or they had been told something about me. I kept my head down and finished my assigned task. The machinery I was checking made the same low groans as before, but everything now carried a sinister undertone. When the shift ended, I returned to my quarters in silence. I had no radio anymore. My only connection to this place had sunk into the ocean, and with it, any chance of listening in on hidden frequencies. I removed my gloves, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and leaned against the wall. Then, without warning, something slid under my door. A folded note. "Be ready. You'll hear a sound in 5 minutes." There was no signature, no further instruction, but I knew it was from him, the voice in the dark. I stared at the words until my heart began to race. 5 minutes. I checked the small analog clock on my wall and counted down silently. Just as the final seconds ticked by, a loud mechanical alarm began to sound. It wasn't the usual emergency drill or work shift siren. This one was distorted, irregular, and clearly unplanned. I opened the door and peeked out. People were running, shouting, clutching tools and helmets. Some guards barked orders, lights flickered above. Smoke leaked from one of the side corridors. Then, from the left, a door creaked open and a hand shot out, grabbing my sleeve and pulling me inside with force. I stumbled, heart hammering, ready to fight whoever it was, but then I heard the voice. "You're late. We need to move." It was him, the hooded figure, the same voice from outside my cell. Still cloaked, still shadowed, but unmistakably calm in the chaos. He handed me a laminated card with an access chip embedded in it. "We're heading for the archive room," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Once we're in, I'll show you what they've been hiding. After that, make your way to the southwestern launch deck. Behind the crate lifts, there's a vertical storage shaft. Crawl space at the base, just enough to hide in. When the noise dies down and the alarms cut off, that's your moment. There should be a launch boat nearby. Take it. Get off this rig and don't look back." I wanted to ask questions. I wanted to know why he was helping me or who he really was, but he had already started moving. I followed. We passed through the lower corridors, weaving through maintenance routes that were temporarily unguarded thanks to the chaos he must have created. At last, we reached the archive level. The card beeped against the scanner and the door hissed open. Inside, rows of cabinets stretched along the walls. Dust-coated binders, labeled by year and sector, formed towering columns. He walked directly to one section marked Pelagos. He pulled out a thick, steel-bound folder and handed it to me. "Everything you need is in here," he said quietly, almost like a whisper meant only for me. His hand lingered for a moment, and in his voice I heard a kind of finality, as if this exchange marked the end of his purpose. "Keep it close. Don't stop for anything. Project Pelagos." The name alone made my stomach turn. We left in silence, the air between us tense and brittle. As we turned the corner, the metallic sheen of the corridor caught a streak of something dark and wet on the floor. I stepped closer and recognized it immediately, a deep, red smear, thick and clotted at the edges. Blood. It trailed along the floor in broken lines, vanishing under a doorframe. The rule came back to me like a whisper in my mind. Rule number 3. If you see blood, report it immediately. Do not touch it. My feet halted. The weight of the folder in my hands seemed heavier. The hooded man looked over his shoulder. Though most of his face was obscured, his expression remained unreadable. He didn't speak or offer any reassurance. He only gave a slight nod, the kind that implied urgency and expectation, as if telling me that this was the only option left. In that silent moment, I understood we had to keep moving. We stepped carefully around the stain. My chest tightened with guilt for not reporting it, but I knew we had no time. That stain served as more than a warning. It marked that whatever force maintained control over this place had already become aware that this place was already aware. And still, we moved forward. The hallway began to shift. Lights dimmed, and the pressure in the air grew dense and suffocating. From around the corner came the unmistakable, wet, dragging sound of something enormous moving with intent. My stomach knotted. I knew that sound. The memory of its form, the stench of seawater and decay, flooded back. This was not a new encounter. It was returning. The same creature I had seen before, the same presence that had haunted the dark edges of this place. My knees weakened and my breath quickened. I was terrified because I knew exactly what it was. I had seen it before. That memory was still vivid in my mind, and now it was happening again. The hooded man stopped, turned toward me, and pulled his goggles off slowly. "You need to run," he said. "Stick to the plan, do not turn back, no matter what happens." He raised both arms and began making loud, deliberate noise, banging against the metal railing beside us. I watched in disbelief as the creature responded, drawn directly to the sound. For a second, I thought he had lost his mind. Who would willingly summon that thing? But even through my fear, I couldn't ignore the steadiness in his actions. There was no hesitation, no sign of panic. As the creature rushed toward him, he didn't flinch. I was torn between horror and awe. He was giving me a chance, and I knew it. As terrified as I was, I found myself moving, driven by the silent demand of his sacrifice. Whatever madness he carried, it came with purpose. The man turned to me once more. "Go." I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the deck. Wind slammed into my face. The sea stretched into black nothingness. I ducked behind the crates near the lift and opened the Project Pelagos file. Pages fell into my lap, notes typed on thin old printer sheets, some of them water-stained, diagrams of the creature, maps of its known movement range, charts of sacrificial rituals encoded in corporate lingo, worker rosters, weekly candidate selection. The special meals were not celebrations, they were tools. The food was infused with suppressants to dull awareness, soften resolve, and make the chosen worker more compliant. Each week, someone vanished. The pattern wasn't random, it was calculated. Someone always disappeared after the meal. They were offered up. But this was never about the creature. Not entirely. It wasn't a cult or a sacred duty. This was about money. The rig's real mission was oil extraction. Massive profit. But deep below, where their drills pierced ancient trenches, they woke something. Something that would not allow them to continue unless it was fed. So they fed it. Sacrifices to protect the business. Human lives as payment of uninterrupted production. Every rule now revealed its true purpose. The goggles shielded you from the creature's gaze. The radios controlled the information flow. The rule about blood meant contamination, a sign of its proximity. The clock, when it ran backward, you had to hide. All of it was orchestrated, not to save lives, but to keep the operation alive. The rig was never meant to protect its workers. It was built to manage an ancient threat without slowing the flow of oil. My hands trembled as I clutched the documents. My breath hitched as the weight of their contents settled in my chest. These files were far beyond mere evidence. They had become my only lifeline. I folded them carefully and tucked them back into the folder, pressing it close to my chest. These pages had to reach land. The truth they carried could not die here. After what felt like an hour, the sirens fell silent. I crept from behind the crates, walked to the side rail, and located a secured emergency dinghy. The release system responded to the access card. I slid the boat into the water and climbed down the rope ladder with the folder strapped to my chest. The engine murmured beneath me as I kept the boat close to the rig's edge, threading my path through the shadows, navigating by the rhythm of swinging spotlights and the dark contours of the structure. The night air pressed in heavy and salty, thick with the tang of machinery and oil. Below, waves smacked against the hull in steady patterns, a lullaby that did nothing to calm the tension in my chest. Every foot I gained felt like a breath released. Distance meant safety, or at least the hope of it. The thought of the hooded man emerged again, unbidden. He had said escape wasn't an option for him. That admission clung to my mind like fog. Why? What had bound him here so permanently? What had he done or seen? The boat swayed with a sudden lift, a rolling swell shifting beneath the hull. I braced myself and scanned the dashboard. A small battered radio sat in the console's cradle. I reached for it, wiping seawater from the dial, and turned the knob slowly. Static cracked and whispered. I bypassed the rig's frequency, cautious not to alert anyone still monitoring. My fingers lingered over the dial. Then, slowly, I began to scan, frequency by frequency, praying to catch a sliver of life out there. Someone. Anyone. But then the water changed. The waves grew restless, their rhythm shattered, dissolving into a chaotic churn. My skin prickled as a low vibration crawled up through the floor of the boat. I turned my head slowly, heart thudding, and saw the sea swell in an unnatural shape. The sight was terrifying, but it wasn't unfamiliar. I had heard this rhythm before, had felt this pressure against my ribs. It was the same pulse I had known on the rig. This fear wasn't new. It was the echo of that creature's return, and this time, I was alone. Before a coherent thought could form, a massive force struck the side of the boat. A sudden impact had slammed into the side of the boat with brute force, unlike anything nature could explain. The vessel heaved sideways, pitching me into the air. My temple cracked against the metal edge as I was flung into the sea. A scream erupted from my lungs but was immediately silenced by the ocean's cold grasp. Water enveloped me, crushing and all-consuming. The folder was ripped from my arms. I reached for it, but it vanished in the darkness below. The surface above rippled like a distant dream, slipping farther away as I sank into blackness. The last thing I felt was the cold, crushing weight of the sea pressing in from all sides. I gasped for air, but my lungs filled with salt and panic. Then everything vanished. My vision collapsed inward, and I sank into unconsciousness. Darkness. Then light. A glare stung my eyes as I blinked against it. Hands gripped my arms, dragging me across wet wood. Voices shouted over the hum of an engine and the slosh of waves. Coughs racked my chest as I heaved out seawater, gasping for air like it was the first breath of my life. I coughed up water and blinked against the sun. I was lying on a wooden deck, surrounded by men in heavy raincoats. "You all right, son?" A rough voice. Calloused hands. They were fishermen. They had found me floating near the shoals. I bolted upright, panic flooding me. "The folder," I said. "The papers." They exchanged confused glances. "We didn't see anything else," one said. "Just you, barely breathing." I collapsed back onto the deck, drenched and broken, salt water clinging to my skin like a second layer. The silence around me roared louder than the sea had. My arms felt hollow, my chest caved in. The folder, my only proof, my only hope, was gone. I had clung to those papers like a lifeline, believing they would change something, expose the horror, save someone. Now they were just ink dissolving into the ocean. Everything I had seen, everything I had endured and sacrificed to uncover, vanished beneath the waves. A sense of failure wrapped around me, tighter than the wet clothes on my back. I had nothing left but memory and the ache of knowing that truth had sunk before it could breathe. Weeks passed. I shared everything I had witnessed, from the rituals to the creature to the desperate escape. Each word felt heavier than the last, but my voice faltered under the weight of disbelief that met me. Without documents, without names or tangible proof, my story sounded like the ramblings of a man broken by the sea. The company issued an official statement. According to them, I had simply fallen overboard during routine maintenance. The rig had no record of anything unusual. My truth had been silenced beneath the official line. Then, one morning, while sipping coffee in a diner near the docks, I saw the headline on a small newspaper. Rig worker Reed Smith found dead under mysterious circumstances. Family demands answers. I stared at the photo, numbness settling over me like a heavy tide. It was him, the hooded man who had led me through the shadows, who had risked everything to hand me the truth. Reed had guided me, protected me, And when it mattered most, he had given himself up so I could run. And now, he had been erased. His name reduced to a few lines in a local paper, his sacrifice swallowed by the same system he tried to fight. All we had done, all we had uncovered, everything we had lost, it had meant nothing. The rig was still running. The company still denying. The creature still lurking beneath the waves, fed by new workers unaware of the rules or their meaning. Every death, every page of evidence, every moment of horror, wasted. I folded the paper slowly, my hands trembling. My heart was heavier than it had ever been. Some truths weren't meant to be told. Some horrors sink into the sea and never rise again.